what really comes into your mind when you think about African design? What comes into your mind when you think about things like African design, identity? What is it really? And if we narrow it further down to things like Kenyan design or Kenyan design, who can you really pinpoint and say that this is someone who is doing legit Kenyan African design? And we are not talking about designers or artists who have been beckoned by a white man or who have been given a go-ahead by the West and have told them and have propped them up to be the African designers who are making legit African design. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what is the first thing that comes into your mind when you think about African design identity. My name is Were Osewe and I am an interior designer based in Nairobi, and I have always been curious about what really defines us as a people. I have always been curious and genuinely interested in African design, things like sustainability. That is the stuff that has always spoken to my soul. That is the stuff that deeply resonates with me. So African design is not about props. African design has never really been about the prints that you see all over. African design, to me, and especially when it comes down to spaces, is more about the spatial logic that our ancestors used. It's about material selection. It's about community conscious living. And for example, in this day and age, if you go to say those sides of village market, all you're going to see is things that craftsmen call African designs, but they are really designed for the white gaze, or let's call it post-colonial gaze. These are things that are designed for the West and are supposed to cater to them and their needs. That is what they call African design. And I think it's about time for us to debunk that, because if it is not accessible, if it is not affordable, then is it African design really? Those are some of the things that we need to question when it comes to thinking deeply and broadly about African design. When you think about African design, you kind of have to also think about how exactly did our ancestors live before colonization? How did our ancestors live before mass production goods? In that, you have to think about cottage industry. You have to think about what did they honor. And when we talk about design repatriations, you really have to think about in what ways am I honoring my ancestors in these designs. In as much as we keep talking about repatriations, we keep talking about colonization, yes, those things happened, but how can we reclaim ourselves? How can we reclaim who we truly are? So like if, for example, if you take away religion and you take away if you take away language, and if you take away the gimmicks of, if you take away the gimmicks of culture that we have left, what can we really define ourselves to be? I generally like what is happening in the music industry, and especially with Sauti Sol. I feel like those are people that are genuinely telling their Kenyan story. Everything that they do is centered around Kenyanness and around Africanness. Hopefully in the future, these are things that are going to have a ripple effect all around the creative scene, because generally speaking, culture and creativity complement each other. They have like a symbiotic relationship of sorts. So it's actually beautiful to see what Sauti Sol guys are doing, and it's beautiful. And I can't wait to have these in the design industry as well, where we tell our stories, we reclaim what was stolen from us with a level of conscience that gears us towards the right direction. We need an identity that is rooted in history, in places, in material. For example, how do we ignore? We ignore stone, we ignore mud, we ignore so many things about, and then we have these things that we decided that now these are the things that are going to be African, and they really aren't, you know. And I'm going to lay down some of the things are not African, and we think they are African, and particularly that are important in this discourse. Number one, we have Safari, and Safari Chic is a colonial realm. When I talk about Safari Chic design, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the kind of designs you see on Limururu. I'm talking about the ridiculously looking carved wood. And they take like huge chunks of carved wood, and then they decide to make a bed out of. I'm talking about safari tent. I'm talking about taxidermy. And by taxidermy, I mean You see the animal head, like someone has taken like a zebra, the zebra's, and stuffed it with material, and then they put it on the wall, and then they say that that's Africa. I'm thinking telescopes, I'm safari boat, and those hats. When I think about that, when I see that type of design, and I'm going to paste them here, when I think about that, all I'm seeing is whips and chains. All I'm seeing is concentration camps. All I'm seeing is literally the torture, the separation of families that happened to our people. And they have decided to call it, now this is what African design is. They take motifs of spears and put them on the walls, or sometimes even the spears itself. I don't really think this is what our ancestors would have done. I don't really think this is what our forefathers would have done. That is not what they could have defined as African culture or Kenyan culture. Because you take that design and like, to me, that is romanticization of what African culture is supposed to be. And we can go further down and maybe go into the rabbit hole of how when you look at these things, safari tents and those boots, the campaign furniture that they had, if you look at that kind of stuff, I think about how zoning was done. The community was literally separated from where they were, So look at all the game reserves and the national parks that we have today. You had to be alienated from that place. A place where our ancestors coexisted with animals. A place where our ancestors lived so well. I mean, there was no big deal about animals and that kind of thing. We coexisted, we lived together in one place. And then someone comes in there, zones out this area, calls it all manner of names, and then they tell you that you have to pay to access this. You have to pay to go and see animals. And then they decorate it in a way that mocks you. They decorate it in a way that reminds you of torture. Maybe you should actually ask yourself why most of a majority of Kenyans have never really gone to any national park, because they're not accessible. And they were made that way deliberately. So when you think about African design, and when you go to these national parks and these safari tents and these resort hotels, does it really speak about the African culture really, or it's just a reminder of the torture that those people meted on us? Is another thing that we think is African culture, but it really isn't. Is one, kitenge fabric; two, what we call the Ankara fabric; three, the Masai shuka. All those things are not African by any means. So like a Dutchman came here. When you look at most kitenge fabrics, you're going to see there like batik, or you're going to see at the bottom of it, it's literally copyrighted. Those motifs and prints were appropriated from the African culture. A certain white man came around, figured out what these African people actually like and how they can capitalize on our pain, how they can even capitalize on our culture. So they took, for example, mud cloth, they went around and took the Adinkra pattern, and then decided to appropriate it, make it African, because they had to study what the African really like. They had to study our culture, our mannerisms, our way of life, and figured out that if I make this print this way, in this manner, these people are going to buy it. Always have it at the back of your head that when you're buying that Masai shuka, that Ankara fabric, or the kitenge fabric, even the leso, all those things were appropriated from the African culture, and you are doing nothing but enriching some white man somewhere, some white man's company somewhere. That's just how it is. I have figured out alternatives when it comes to genuine African patterns, which is a company with like someone who taught me in the university. It's called Undameta. You can go in there and find out what they do, and the kind of patterns they actually they've come up with. And it's not appropriation, it is not stealing, it is not replacing a meaning of something and giving it a different definition. Maybe if that is something that you're interested in and you really want to explore, that is what you can check out. And the worst part about it is that even today, many designers and craftsmen will literally make something, throw in Ankara in there, you throw in the Masai shuka in there, and then you call it African design. There is nothing that is African about all those things. As creatives, we need to do better when it comes to coming up with prints and surface textile patterns that actually speak to us, that tell our story. And speaking of which, yeah, we really lack an African identity as a people, to the point where if you look at our homes, they all look the same. I'm going to try and paste some of the things that I have in mind. If you look at Kenyan homes post 2020, they look the same. Post 2010, they look the same. Post 2000, they look the same. Even in the 90s, and it's the exact same fabric, couches, tile, finishes, and even artwork. The live, love. I know you all can resonate, but they all look the same. You look at Airbnbs today; they look like branches of each other. You'd think that they were branded by the same person, just dropped into different locations. They look exactly the same. I'm going to add something that talks about all of that. But then again, yeah, that is because we lack an identity as a people. That is because we don't really have what speaks to us. We have become kleptomaniacs of aspect of other people's culture. We take it and then we call it ours. And it's not supposed to be that way. We are better than that. If you take, for example, the kind of finishes, I want to step into your space. I want to see who you are, what you stand for, what your ancestors believed in. I want to see you, your personality. I don't want a copy-paste version of some Chinese who these Dubai finishes everyone likes nowadays. The chromes, the golds. I don't want to see that. I want to see you. I want to see the cottage industry represented in your space. And it doesn't have to be expensive. It just has to, these things are genuinely available, but we refuse to. We don't know who we are as people. The next bit is I want to talk about why the African Safari Chic is problematic and why we really need to have a stand on what our identity is.